We live in a world where conflicts are happening all across. For example, as I'm recording this, you have reports coming in of the fact that the Indian Navy had boarded two merchant vessels bearing the Iranian flag for suspected attack on the two merchant vessels that were coming in towards India. You have a conflict that is happening in the Middle East, of course, between Israel and Palestine. Then you have the Russia-Ukraine thing. Then you have a whole standoff, not a standoff, but a kind of heightened tension which is happening in South China Sea between, of course, China, Taiwan, US. Then you also have the over 3 year long standoff that is happening between India and China at the LAC, all along the LAC. And among all these conflicts that is happening, one of the key factors which come into play is while of course the ground forces do matter, but is also air power. And when I say air power, I'm not restricting myself to only just fighters. It involves cyber, it involves space. Why I mention space is, for example, a lot of movement that is being tracked up from the enemy side is being done through satellites. Communications is a key focus area. And in between all this, we of course have our Indian Air Force, which right now stands at 33 fighter squadron strength of 33 right now, as against a sanctioned strength of 42. And remember, when I say 33, don't forget that the 33 is made up of, let's say, the MiG-21 Bisons, 3 squadrons of this. And usually in the Air Force, a squadron would mean 16 plus 2. But the MiG-21 Bison squadrons are not complete. Some squadrons will have 7 fighters, some squadrons will have 10 fighters. We also include the Jaguars, which are not, at the height of their operational capabilities because of the engines. This will also include the Su-30 MKI, which were first inducted way back in the late 90s, which will now undergo an upgrade process. And among all this, I have with me a very interesting guest. Now, I have with me Air Marshal, Doctor, I must say, Diptendu Choudhury. He is retired now. He retired as the commandant of the National Defense College here in the national capital. He is someone who has been in operations forever from the time that he was commissioned. Why I say he was in operations forever is because he's never been an instructor. He's never been in the flying school teaching others. So he's been in operations throughout. And he's someone who specializes, who's flown all kinds of the MiG series of fighters, as well as the Sukhoi fighters that the Indian Air Force has. So welcome to ThePrint, sir. And the fact is that he's now come up with this new book called The Indian Air Power Contemporary and Future Dynamics. Now, this book was released last week by the Air Force Chief, Air Chief Marshal V.R. Choudhury. So congratulations, sir, and welcome to ThePrint.
Thank you, Snehesh, and it's a pleasure and a privilege to be here and sitting and chatting with you again, and this time in a studio, which is a welcome change. And yes, I think thank you for that introduction. I mean, it's only thing is, yes, while I may not have been a classical flying instructor, but I was a combat instructor. But I spent a lot of time in, like you mentioned, in fundamentally in operations, strategy.
Exactly. That's exactly what I wanted to bring out.
I get that.
So what do you mean by air power? And does air power mean the big fighters, the ones that we see in movies and all of bombings? Is that what air power is all about?
Okay, aviation itself is relatively young. It's just about a little over 100 years old. And when aviation, the armies and navies have been there forever. And they were essentially a huge part of statecraft over the years. But when aviation broke into the scene, it was very quickly inducted into warfighting from the World War I. And by World War II, air power had become, and the air forces had become a service by itself, an independent service by itself. It sort of cut its teeth in World War I, and by World War II, it was firmly established And what makes air power really special is possibly the fact that it uses the vertical dimension to transcend the challenges which the surface forces face of traction, of terrain friction, or operating in the seas, where your speeds, your reach are restricted and it takes a lot of time. But air was able to use the vertical medium, the aerial medium, to reach across and not be impeded by these. So that brought in tremendous flexibility into air power itself, and the whole concept evolved from that. And the air forces, in fact, initially were hived off the army.
Yeah.
You know, they had the Royal Flying Corps, and from which later on, but the Brits were very prescient on this. They insisted on making air power independent very early, and it had its own reasons for it. And unfortunately, I think the world has an impression of a very glamorous picture of World War II fighter pilots, you know, in the air, shooting down enemy aircraft, you know, like
With the aviator glasses.
Aviator glasses. There's like, you know, knights of the air, that kind of thing. In fact, very honestly, in our younger days, that's how we also grew up. But that was just a sort of icing on the cake kind of thing. Actually, air power is a very serious business, and it's not only to do with fighter aircraft. It encompasses an entire realm of warfighting systems, of platforms, of varied platforms, you know, fighters, transports, helicopters, today, air defense radars, air defense weaponry. It's a whole package. And as technology kept progressing, integrating this whole lot into a comprehensive force, you know, through networks, communications, and as technology improved, the capabilities improved. And today you have an air power which is a holistic and a very comprehensive kind of a force. In fact, I'm sure we'll be discussing that very soon, is how it also reaches into the space, or the near space. So that's what air power, very simply, is what it is all about, I would think.
So when it comes to the Indian context, you know, there are two countries that we really face off, you know, when it comes to whether it's the Navy, Air Force, or for that matter, the Army. One is, of course, Pakistan. In Pakistan case, you know, please forgive me for my whatever little understanding that I have. I feel that, you know, Pakistan has invested the money very smartly when it comes to their military, especially when it comes to their Air Force itself. Pakistan has invested in capabilities that will act as a deterrent. For example, you know, the Pakistan going in for long range missiles that came in handy when the Pakistan carried out retaliatory strikes. I would not say retaliatory strike, but retaliatory attack post the Balakot incident, you know, where the Indian Air Force was found lacking a bit, if I may say. But that is something that we have dealt with in the past, and that is something we'll always deal with. But looking at the northern neighbor, China, you know, how do you see their air power capability? For example, you know, I was just watching this. The Chinese have really come out with a new movie. It's there on Amazon. It's a very you know, propaganda movie that the Chinese have come out with, and it's called Born to Fly. Now, this is the answer to the American movie, and I watched the movie and I was amazed by the quality of production and the way that the storyline has been completely brought in, which focuses on, again, on air power. How do you see the Chinese air power, sir?
So I'll just take a starter of our neighbor, the western neighbor. So Pakistan Air Force has somehow always managed to hold its Air Force in sort of high esteem. In fact, right from 65 and 71, their Air Force was made out to be one of the best in the world. And they had the advantage of having interacted on a regular basis with the Western Air Forces. And so that got them a lot of attention. They know there's to go across international for exercises and a lot of exposure for their officers. But And very interestingly, in 65 and 71, they created a myth, especially in 65, where it was that the Air Force actually saved the nation. But the problem was, people went with, when you looked at the outcome of two wars, when you look at it whether from a pure bean count perspective, of the metrics of it, how many aircrafts were lost and all that, we lost more aircraft. But that was most certainly because we did way 3 times amount of flying.
Yeah.
And operational flying over their airspaces. So those myths are being busted now. There's a whole lot of writing available in the Indian domain, well researched stuff which was not known to most people in the past, that the Indian Air Force did very well in the wars. They continued maintaining that they wanted to keep their Air Force there. And their Air Force is constantly being evolved, but they had a huge amount of assistance from the US.
Yeah.
So in the waxing and waning of their relationship with the US, they very smartly kept their cutting edge sharpened and state of art. And in fact, the difference was from Kargil and Balakot was that in Kargil, we had the weapon dominance. In terms of the missile reach and the platform capabilities. Whereas we lost that edge out when the Pakistanis brought in AMRAAMs.
Yeah.
But we knew that, and we were working hard on it. Today we have indigenous programs which are, fill that gap.
There's the Astra.
Yeah, absolutely. Whereas the Chinese Air Force is an entirely different story. It had its last real serious war was in Korea. And thereafter, there's a little bit of participation, not actively, but more in terms of, not in terms of really kinetic air battles, but more in terms of presence and of use of air power to dominate, or at least create a sense of the vertical dimension being dominated in Vietnam. But they really didn't use their air power offensively ever. Gulf War was an eye-opener for them. In fact, if you read the book Unrestricted Warfare by these two PLAAF colonels, very interestingly, the Air Force colonels who wrote this book, and they looked at how space had come into warfare, and they brought in these changes of warfare immensely. And over a period of from the Gulf War onwards, they had very clear strategic long-term objectives, which they put it out in the form of white papers over the years. And if you look at them and study them closely, you'll realize that there was a very steady capability expansion, which is very graded, and they made sure they ticked every box, and they reached a stage where air power came in a big way into the Air Force. But the challenge is they never had any operational experience.
Yeah,
that is one. B, very little international exposure, because their pilots would never go outside. And it's only much later years they started training a little bit with Turkey, a lot with Pakistan. We have the Exercise Shaheen series, which they're doing with them. And why were they doing that? To get Western tactics and exposure and Indian tactics and exposure through the Pakistani Air Force. Look at Taiwan. China is today using the PLAAF, the Chinese Air Force, as an instrument of national security. It's a part of their statecraft today. It's using its air power immensely in Taiwan, in the South China Seas. Not only to bother, if you look at the kind of air violations which are taking place over the Taiwan Strait. Unprecedented. You look at the islands they have created in the South China Sea.
Exactly.
They have airfields. 3 of them have airfields, and all put together, they can put over close to 200 odd aircraft into those islands and with their weapon systems. So what have they done? Earlier, their Air Force used to look at air defense of the mainland. That was the main role of the Air Force. But now they have pushed this role. They pushed their Air Force out into the seas, literally, where now they choose to dominate the airspace around with its offensive capabilities. And their main goal is to push the Americans past their first island chain, which they have
almost done.
Which they've almost done. And in fact, their goal is probably to reach across to the second island chain. So what are they looking at? They're looking at dominating the skies over the seas. So effectively, it's classic, if you remember the old time Gilo Duhe, who wrote about air power extensively, who said that if you own the skies, you literally own the space below. So here with the strong PL Navy, which dominates the waters, and if you bring in the PLAAF, which dominates the skies, they pretty much own the airspace. They own the real estate there. So that's the significance, the way the Chinese air power has progressed so rapidly over the years.
So, that brings me back to our Air Force. Indian Air Force has a glorious history. But air power is not something that has been intrinsically used as part of the overall Indian military strategy. Also the fact is that, as I earlier mentioned in my introduction, viewers, that against a sanctioned strength of 42, which is the public, otherwise it's about 45, we just have 33 fighter squadron strength. And of the 33, many of them are not in the full numbers itself. Of course, the Indian Air Force has gone in for the 83 squadrons of 83 more LCA Mark 1As, and there's additional order for 100 more which will be placed, and there's of course Tejas Mark 2 and things like that, and then of course the futuristic the AMCA program, which is the 5th generation thing. Now the Indian Air Force, I think the name is being, there's a file that has been moved by the Air Force to change the name from the Indian Air Force to what now? Now what will be the Indian Air Force known as?
Like the Air and Space Force.
So Air and Space Force. So is this just a change in nomenclature or in change, or are we really now become a space power? I really would want to know. Is this just naming of Delhi to Delhi or whatever other naming that we have in this country? Is this just a change in name, or is there a serious change in capability?
So it's very interesting you say that, because in fact, when we first proclaimed that Indian Air Force has strategic capabilities and as a strategic power, capabilities as a military power, there was a lot of tussle on that. In fact, there was a lot of internal tussle within the Air Forces, because we felt that there was a time where there was thought that if you don't have bombers, if you don't have long-range capabilities, you can't be a strategic force, a strategic air force. But our air-to-air refueling, our AWACS, today we have unprecedented reach. We have been across the continent all the way to US, Australia, and exercised that, which are classic cases of demonstration of a strategic capability, and we've gone and taken part in active exercises. We're doing more of that. I think this year itself, we've done some unprecedented amount of, 9 exercises, if I'm not wrong. So what is it actually? So actually is that the Air Force, unlike the other services, being technology, sort of, I won't say dependent, but it is so intrinsically enmeshed with technology that any rapid changes in technology brings in rapid changes of platform capabilities, weapon capabilities, which brings in a whole lot of new options of warfighting concepts. It widens the envelope. Today, what 8 MiG-21s could probably, the number of bombs it could drop on a target, one Su-30 does that. And so it has brought in a tremendous amount of capability and a capacity change. Capacity to an extent is, like you mentioned, with 33 squadrons, that is something we are really concerned about, and I'm sure we all know that the government is acutely seized of it and doing what it can, and it takes time to build capacity. But the fact is, the kind of capabilities we have today is something which we didn't have 10 years ago or 20 years ago, which has rapidly kept improving over the years. Now, this brings in a fact that because of the technology dependency, the Indian Air Force had initiated a lot of changes in its net centricity, in its communications, in its command, ISCC as command and control system, networking of the radars. Basically, have a situational awareness of an airspace, a volume of airspace. Now, when we talk about airspace, people think, it's only in the country. Little do we realize that the airspace stretches right all the way up to the Kármán line, in fact, and right across the border. So even above the borders, the airspace is sovereign airspace. And so this becomes an important aspect of the fact that these advanced capabilities, where we started using space-based systems, as you know, which were important aspects for all our a lot of our aviation, right from meteorology, that is the weather, from navigation, targeting, communications, C4ISR, everything was became space related. So when we started, when the Indian Air Force put it out in its doctrine that, you know, aerospace force, that itself created sort of ruffled a lot of feathers, a lot of places. But this is an inevitability. It will be, I think, a little short-sighted on our part to deny this change. And the fact that the near space, now there's a distinct difference here. Near space has come into the operational realm of war fighting, which is we are very cognizant about. So when you say air and space power, it's a little different, where now you're looking at reaching out into the outer space. Air Force is very clear in its doctrine. It doesn't lay sole claim to the space. To the Indian Air Force, it is national commons. The civilian agencies, the other services, they all have their rightful role and sort of stake in the space pie, if I may put it. But the only difference is, because of the kind of, you know, this air and space continuum, and in the realm and the medium we have been sort of actively involved in over the years, it is but a natural extension to reach out into the space domain. It becomes a natural lead for any other agency or service. Everyone's welcome on board, but it's just that we do this more naturally. It comes as a sort of a second nature to us to think in a three-dimensional perspective.
Okay, perfect. So when it comes to air warfare again, I'll bring up the example of the Russia-Ukraine war. And that has really taken a lot many people by surprise, and military strategists and militaries across the world are closely studying this. And one of the things that has really come out is the fact that we all imagine the Russian Air Force to be the old powerful Russian Air Force, and but you know, the over a year and a half conflict has shown the fact that the Russia has been unable to deploy its aircraft as it would have wanted against Ukraine. For example, as we speak, this last week itself, the Ukrainians managed to shoot down 3 Su-34s and 1 Su-30 of the Russian through the new Patriot, air defense system that have been given by the Europeans to Ukraine. Also, you know, the whole focus on drone warfare, you know, loitering munitions, drones. How is the Indian Air Force gearing up to these changes? There are some people who feel that we are slow in making these changes, and there are also a certain section of people which feel that the Indian Air Force also is not very gung-ho about the drone warfare, because it feels that too much money will go into drones and then they would be left with less fighters. So it's fighters versus drones. How do you see that, sir?
You know, it's a very interesting question, in fact, from the point of view of the fact when you're talking about drones. The Indian Air Force had killer drones for over a decade plus.
Yeah, in early 2000.
Yeah, almost 2 decades, in fact.
Yeah.
It was a part of our war fighting repertoire. It was expensive, but we understood the need for it and we inducted it.
Surprisingly, you know, when people were mentioning about this, I was one of the first ones to mention this fact. And many people were not aware of the fact that the Indian Air Force had it. Yeah.
So the Indian Air Force has done a lot of stuff quietly for a very long time, because we understand technology and we understand which are the gaps which we need to fill, you know, with newer technology. And we've been doing that. So drones were a part of a kinetic warfighting repertoire as much as it was for, for surveillance and reconnaissance, for intelligence gathering. So we've been dealing with drones, but it's expensive. And there are other issues to it. While drones have become cheaper in the present day context of warfighting, which you're mentioning, but the fact of it is today, and this is something which is coming out in the Ukraine war, that they are immensely vulnerable to surface to air guided weapons.
But so is the fighters and helicopters.
Absolutely, absolutely. But to think that the drones are a panacea and a replacement for that is a mistake. That is what my point is.
Yeah.
And the other issue is that when you talked about the Russian Air Force, now that's very interesting that you mentioned that, because the Russian Air Force structurally, organizationally and doctrinally has been all about defending the motherland. So the Russian offensive part of their Air Force was what they called the frontal aviation, which was literally like a flying artillery. It was only there to support the ground campaign. You have to understand the context that from World War II days, it was more about the enemy coming deep into the heartland.
Yeah.
So they had an air defense system, a force actually, called the PVO Strani.
Yeah.
Which was the air defense forces, which had its own fighters, high altitude missiles, entire range of surface to air weapons, and fighters as well. But in 1999, I think they merged it, post the Gulf War, they merged it with the Air Force to make it what it is today, the VKS, the Russian Aerospace Forces.
Yeah, I was just mentioning the space factors.
Yeah, Aerospace Forces. So they learned this from the Gulf War. So they realized what space and how important it is. But here lies the challenge. Russian Air Force has always been a subordinate to the surface campaign, warfighting campaign. Doctrinally, it does not have the freedom to use or the air power where the West does. Hence, you will find there's a lot of sort of decry from the Western experts that, Russia doesn't know how to use air power. But I'll argue that is the way Russia conceived its air power. Yes, it has found its severe limitations and shortcomings. Probably they'll change in the future. Another thing what they had done was they had subordinated air power under the Russian military. They have theaters, what they call this operational, like the operational theater commands, the Western Theater Command and equivalent really, OSKs they're called, Operational Strategic Commands. And they hived off the tactical air force and redistributed amongst these commands. And you see what has come out. They have not been able to integrate their air defense with their surface operations. Their tactical air force has not been able to create the environment for the surface operations against to go through. It has stagnated. They did not carry out, after the initial very great start, they didn't see through with the offensive air campaign, where they should have actually handled the seared and they should have taken out the enemy air defense, but which they didn't, and now they're now paying for it. So, and then this, what you mentioned, that way the Russian Air Force is getting hammered probably by the for the Ukrainians, but that has another interesting aspect to it. The Ukrainian Air Force and the Ukrainian military has been propped up by the Western influx of weapons in huge numbers. It's almost become a testing ground for all the Western military industry.
Yeah.
And if you get into the sort of little bit of research on it, you will find the Americans' foreign military sales have gone up by probably 50% in this period. So obviously, the drone industry will push and market it in a manner. The air defense industry will push and market it in it with its own vested interest. But I would think if you look at war fighting from a larger picture, every bit counts. Okay. Drones, precision munitions, killer drones, AI and all that what we bring in today will all become a complex part of a war fighting structure and part of air forces as well.
Absolutely. But what really matters is the decision to make where to invest more and what to focus on more. So one thing that I've noticed is the fact that when it comes to countries focusing on, indigenous technology, for example, the Americans or the Chinese, for example, the Chinese, the big focus on having its own indigenous fifth generation fighter aircraft, having its own indigenous engines to fire up those fighters, long-range missiles. Their capability, long-range missiles means the rocket force, besides, of course, the Air Force long-range missiles. The US, for example, you earlier mentioned about the bombers. You know, the US had those bombers because because the US was focusing on a certain kind of capability. And we were earlier having this discussion where you mentioned the fact that these countries focus on capability, and then, you know, the need for what capability they want, and then they go on focusing on the systems for it, you know, integrating and manufacturing and developing. How does that work in India? Is this how we also operate? Because personally, I think that's not how we operate. But you are the expert on it. I'm the outsider, you know. So you are the expert. So how does India operate in a similar fashion? And if not, do we need to operate in a similar fashion?
So I suspect this comes out of a simple fact that what was our worldview when we became independent till where we have reached today. Earlier, it was more about coping with serious issues of post-independence, poverty, not enough money, need for developing the country. And defense was always a huge, it eats into the budget in a very serious manner. And not paying attention to defense is something which we realized in 1962. We paid for it dearly. And that's something our government today is acutely aware of. But what it also means that countries, which you just mentioned, have had a head start in these developments. And it takes time to develop a fighter or a weapon system. It takes a lot of time and a lot of investment and research, which we frankly couldn't afford till some time back. And getting niche technologies was a huge challenge because they become proprietary items and nobody wants to part with it. Today, we are acutely aware of all that. And you mentioned fifth generation fighters. Every country, from the US, even Russia, China. France, they're all investing in the sixth generation fighter.
Exactly.
They're all investing in bombers.
Yeah.
So don't wish away bombers and fighters in a hurry.
No, I'm not here.
No, that's just a joke, because there's a lot of narrative on that do we really need manned aircraft and stuff like that. They will always have the place.
Of course.
The salience in terms of that, okay, you only need manned fighters. No, it'll be a much wider mix. But we, I think, have realized the need for this change for a long time. And the Russian war, if anything, sort of underscored this need to be self-sufficient, in a big way. And now we have the government sort of investing a lot in this need to be self-sufficient, Atmanirbharta as the buzzword. And I think over time, because we've had this fantastic aviation industry, we produced the Marut, which was a phenomenal platform, but didn't go anywhere because of engines. And now that we have the engines coming in from the US, and I'm sure it'll lead into more aero engine development and platform development and capabilities into the future. So this is something I think we have der aaye but durust aaye.
Okay, der aaye but durust aaye. I hope we are really there yet. But thank you so much, sir, for speaking to the print. I know, viewers, that we would have loved to continue this discussion for much longer time, but then there's paucity of time. But as I mentioned earlier, this is his new book which has come out, which is a collection of his columns and what his thought process. And one thing that I didn't describe earlier about him was the fact that he is the person behind the Air Force doctrine, the latest doctrine. So he's the author of the Air Force doctrine. So yes, he's the man responsible for that. But yes, viewers, Indian Air Park, Contemporary and Future Dynamics. And yes, so as you say, this is available on Amazon. So log in, get this book, and of course follow him, his writings. He writes for us also. I would request him to write more for us now. And so yes, thank you so much for logging in and listening to this conversation. I hope it was good for you and you liked it.